In this video demonstration, we're going to look at how to record audio in Android. Now, I've created a sample project and I've already set up my user interface. So I have buttons here that are going to initialize the recorder. We'll start recording, then we'll stop recording. We'll be able to review or play back the video that was just recorded, and then stop playback. I have a placeholder here that will be set up in the code so that while it is recording, it will say recording, and when it's not recording, then this will disappear, much like you would have in a regular camcorder. And I also added a video view, which will display the video as it's being played back and as it's being recorded. And just to show the layout, what I have here, I have a linear layout, and then inside that I have each of these two linear layouts side by side next to each other. So you can see that this is one layout over here containing all of my buttons, and then another linear layout over here where I have my recording text and my video view. So this video view is just the video view dragged out over from the images and media section. And you can also see that I have my layout set up in landscape view, because this is typically what's going to appear when you have your video controls. So what I would like to do also is to force this application into landscape so that these don't get all twisted around when the screen is set up to be portrait. So I'm going to force this by going into my manifest file, and within the manifest file I'm going to add in an attribute in the activity tag that will force this into landscape view. So Android screen orientation equals landscape will force this into landscape mode when the activity starts. And also each of these buttons, let me point out how these are set up. They each have their own unique ID because we'll be referencing those in our code. And they're also all set up to go to the on click for button tapped. So when each of these are tapped, it's going to do the button tapped method that will be in our main Java. So this is very similar in structure to the audio recording example that I had in a previous video. So now that you've seen the placeholder text, I'm going to go in and remove that out of there. And I'm just going to put a space in. And it's going to disappear off of the screen and be a little tricky to find. The best way to find it once that isn't there would be to come in here and select it from the outline view. Next, let's go into the main Java file and look. I already have some code laid out and set up in advance for us. So we are doing the typical class extends activity, but we're going to add on a little bit. You'll find that this is going to be similar in structure to the recording audio demo that I did, but with one difference. Video requires that you preview the camera images onto what's called a surface object. So we're going to be using a surface object to be able to preview the video and review it once we're finished. Where, of course, since we were doing audio before, we didn't have to see what the camera was seeing. So in order to implement that, we're going to extend this so that it implements the surface holder callback. And the surface holder callback is used to receive an indication of when the surface is ready for displaying a video image. And our surface is going to come from our video view. Now, some other things that we also want to implement in our activity will be to listen for any messages coming from our MediaRecorder. So we're also going to include an on-info listener and an on-error listener. So we'll be implementing part of this in our code as we come up. But with surface holder, I'm going to import that, as well as the info listener and error listener. I'll just do them all at once. And you can see that over my main now, I have unimplemented methods, and it says that I have to implement the surface holder callback surface destroyed method. So I'm going to add these unimplemented methods, which it's added toward the bottom here, and we'll fill these in coming up in some future steps. Okay, some of the other things that I had set up are references to these different member fields. We'll need these later, references to the different buttons, so I've just set them up ahead of time in here. And I'm getting references to all those elements on the user interface, so these are all of the IDs for the buttons and for our video view. And in a similar nature to the audio recording, right, all of the buttons are set up to use this do click method, and actually mine is set up for, so just double checking back in my main XML, right, these buttons were set up to do a button tapped on click. So I want to make sure that my method reflects that. So it's button tapped, and it's going to get the ID for the button that was tapped, and then we have a case built for each button. So this is for the initialize button, and then the start button, and the stop button, etc. And I made up methods for each of these, right? We're going to initialize the recorder, make sure it's ready, and the camera is ready, and the surface is ready for us to start recording. And so I have a method, initialize recorder, and then we have different methods for each of our other button taps. And then all I've done was automatically generate those. So we have these with their method stubs already in place, ready for us to add in the code for what we want it to do. So we'll start building it from here. I'm going to start by creating an onResume method. If you remember, onResume is called after onStart, so that once the application begins, we'll be able to initialize the camera from there and just make sure that we can first of all access it. And then that would also happen if the application is moved into the background for some reason, like a text message or a phone call coming in, and then bring it back into the foreground, and it would run the onResume. So I'm going to move to the end of the code, and I'm going to paste in my onResume. So we have a log statement, and we're initializing all of the buttons. We're setting them to false. They're not enabled until after we can check and make sure that our camera is initialized. And we haven't created the method yet to create the init camera. So I'm going to have it generate a stub for us, and we'll be able to check and make sure that our camera is available and our surface view is available. Now you can see how init camera is being used. It's in an if statement, so it's looking to see whether it is true or false. So when it generated this method, it gave us a Boolean, right? The default on the other ones is public void. This created a private Boolean to be able to come in here and check to see whether this eventually returns true or false. And it also gave us an automatic return false. So I'm going to update the code in this method, and I'm going to need to initialize some things. We do need to initialize the log statement to import that. And we have a camera object, so we've got to create the camera object, which is going to get the parameters. And in this case, we're getting the default parameters of the camera object. So in order to get rid of all of these, I'm going to move up to the top and set these up. So I'm going to add in for the surface holder, and it's just going to be called holder, and the camera, and I need to import camera. Now, be careful in here when you're importing. We want to make sure that you're importing the camera hardware, not the graphics. So we actually need to access the hardware of the camera. And I also need to include in a string for the tag information, so we'll be able to follow the process of whether things are ready or prepared or not. So we'll add in a string for tag, and then we'll be able to follow that in our console. So let me move back down to our method and see what is still, looks like everything else imported in okay. So just as this on resume runs in after on start, so it's going to disable the buttons to make sure that they don't work until the camera is initialized. And once it comes down here and it initializes the camera and it gets the surface holder, which is called holder, then we're able to actually initialize the camera and say, yes, it's ready for us to use. Otherwise, we'll get a message that said it couldn't initialize the camera. Now in here, we've added a callback to our holder, which is our surface view. So we need to check the surface view to make sure that it's available and ready to use. So we need to update the surface created method up in here. So I'm going to add the code for that, and we're going to do a log statement so that it'll say we got this far, or if we have an error that it couldn't generate the preview. I need to import in the IO exception. So it's going to try to set the preview display in our surface holder and then start the preview. And if for some reason it can't do that, it's going to log a statement. And then if that works, then our initialize button is going to be enabled and let the user click on it. So now from here, we can go in and begin to set up each of our methods that are associated with our buttons. So the first button is to initialize the recorder. So I'm going to paste in some code, and this should look pretty familiar to working with the audio recording example. And I need to do some more setup in order for this to work. So we have to import in a bunch of things. So let me just do all that at once, and need to set up our external storage directory. So we have to have our file name for our output. We need to create a recorder object. So let me move up to the top here and we will set them up. So we have a recorder object, and then we have our output file name. So if I move back down here, then that should have taken care of everything. So in similar fashion to recording the audio, in here where if there's no recorder yet, then it's going to create a file name called output mp4, and it's going to go to the external storage directory, and that's where our file for our video will be saved. And then we're going to check to see if that file is already there. If it is, it's going to delete it. Then we have our try and catch. So if the preview is going on, it's going to stop it. It's going to unlock the camera. We create a new MediaRecorder object called recorder, and we're going to set that equal to our camera that we've initialized. And then we set up a number of different parameters, like video, the audio source from our camcorder, our video source is coming from the camera, our output format for the video file, and the size and the frame rate of the video, the type of encoding for the video and audio, the max duration, how long we're going to let them record for. So we just have a short amount of time in here so as not to use up all the space, but you can adjust that. And we're setting the preview display to our surface holder, and we're setting the output file to our file name. So then we prepare it, we log a message saying it's ready to go, and then we disable the initialize button because it's already initialized, so we don't want them to be able to click it again. And then we have the start button ready to go and start recording. And if we have any errors, then we'll get an exception and display an error to the console. So that is for setting up the initialize recorder button. Next, we'll do the begin recording and stop recording. So begin recording, We had a set on info listener and a set on error listener so that we can receive errors and information about our recording status. We start the recorder. We're changing the text in our text view to say recording. Right now it's just set to a space or an empty string. And then we set the start button to false so that we can't start it again because it's already recording. And the stop button is now enabled. We'll set up the stop recording method next. So we'll paste in code. And again, very similar to the audio. If the recorder is not null, then again we start the error listener and the info listener. And we stop the recorder, and if there are any errors or problems, then we'll get a message. And then we have release recorder and release camera, and we have to build these methods to release them. And then we change our buttons according to what should be available to click on and not to click on. So I'm going to add the release recorder method and the release camera method that we can set up next. So for release camera, so that means we have a camera object, so we will try to reconnect it, and then if we have any errors we'll get an exception error, and then we release the camera and set it to empty. And we're going to do similar thing to release recorder. Okay, if the recorder's not empty, we're going to release it and then set it to empty as well. Okay, so far we have the start recording or initialize the camera, initialize the recorder. Once the recorder and the camera are initialized, then we can start recording. We have stop recording set up, and then those call two other methods to release the camera and release the recorder. So next we can go in and begin to set up the other methods that we have in here for reviewing or playing back, and then stop playing back. Okay, in play recording, we have a media controller that I need to import, and this should just be output file name. Okay, so we have our media controller called MC, and we're getting our video view in our layout, and then we're setting our media controller to that video view. We're getting the output file name of the video file that was just recorded, and we start playing it, and we enable the stop button. And next we can do the stop playback. And for stop playback, probably the easiest one of all, we say our video view, stop playback. Now before we can test this in our emulator, we do need to set up the manifest file with permissions. So I'm going to add the uses permissions. And first of all, we need to be able to write to the external storage. So let me find the write external storage. We also need to record audio. And then the third thing is we need for permission to use the camera. Okay, now I think we're ready to save everything and then run it in the emulator. Okay, so in my emulator, you can see that these have all been disabled, so we can't click on anything until this is initialized. And it isn't doing anything after initialized. So I'm going to go back into my logcat and look at the messages to see if I can figure out what's going on here. We can see that it's got into on resume, so our little messages there helped. And we got into in surface created, and then we have an error here. So using format 17 not supported by the GL, and then MediaRecorder failed to initialize. So that's why we included those messages in there, because it can really help with troubleshooting to see, okay, you got this far, where did things go wrong? So it got as far as in surface created. So we go back to the main Java and look at in our surface created, and it was in here trying to set up the preview and start the preview. So I'm going to check in my virtual device manager. It was opening up Google APIs. So I'm going to check that and make sure, okay, this doesn't have a size for the SD card. So let me put in a size for that. That might have been one of the issues. And I can also see that there isn't any support here for camera. So I'm going to make sure that camera support is in there. And I'm also going to make sure the SD card support is in. And anything else? I'm just going to do audio recording and audio playback because the video would have audio with it. So just in case that might be an issue, I want to make sure that's turned on. So then I'll click Edit AVD, and I'm going to go ahead and start this. And then I'm going to go back in and try running this again. Okay, so we'll try this initialize again. All right, now it went to start, and I can click on start, and it says recording. I'm not seeing anything on my emulator, so I'm going to choose stop. Now I should be able to review, and it wasn't actually recording any video, so there isn't anything to play back. So I'm going to test this on an actual device just to make sure that this code does in fact work for you. Okay, after plugging this in and running it on an actual device, it worked flawlessly. So I believe it would be just an issue with the emulator being able to test recording video and playing it back. Now, just to finish things off here, when we set this up, we did create an on-info listener and an on-error listener, but we never really implemented them. So I'm going to add the methods in here, and I'm just going to add it right in here closer to the top. And let me put them in. And my error message is saying duplicate method. So I think I did add these in automatically when we were referring to them. So let me get rid of these down here and then move back up. All right. And then I just need to import toast. So if there's information, we have a recording event. So we're listening for that. And if we run past the maximum duration, then we're going to get a message about that. And then it'll stop recording and then display a toast. And with an error, if our MediaRecorder runs into an error, then we're going to log that we got one and then display that in a toast. So I'm going to try rerunning this again and see if we get any toast messages that come up when running this on an emulator. So we initialize. It has the surface prepared. MediaRecorder has been initialized. So when I go to start, so recording error has occurred, so there isn't much else we can do from here because we don't have a camera, or it's not actually able to record from the video camera. So none of these other options are available to us. So if you have a device that has a camera that is capable of recording video, then I would recommend giving this a try. It's kind of fun and interesting to see, and you may be able to develop some apps where the user can go out and grab video and then save it and then do something with it.